Hi there, welcome to Belfast High School History Department on YouTube. This little video is going to look at different attitudes towards Prohibition in the 1920s, and you might ask yourself, why the 1920s? Well, just because Prohibition had already been introduced in the 1920s did not mean the arguments went away. In fact, they simmered on throughout the 20s and early 30s between the dries, those who wanted alcohol to remain prohibited, who stood in favour of Prohibition, and the wets, those who wanted alcohol to be reintroduced, wanted an end to Prohibition, and wanted the amendment to be reversed. It'd be the first time in American history that an amendment had been reversed, but that's exactly what would happen. But let's look at the arguments for both sides in the 1920s, starting with the dries. So obviously the dries are all in favour of Prohibition. They believe it is a good policy, and they stand in favour of it. And there's a number of arguments they put forward to keeping Prohibition. The first is that an economic argument. It's the argument about jobs, that millions of hours of work were actually lost before Prohibition because of absenteeism and because of ill health, all to do with alcoholism. It really would have affected American productivity, they would have suggested. They also point to tax. Obviously, on the wet side, they would argue that more tax revenue is bought by alcohol. On the dry side, they say, well, look, income tax, the new income tax in America should be able to certainly overcome that loss of tax by alcohol. They also argued as well that America was a healthier place, and that healthier place would have actually meant that there'd be less tax needed to counter that. They argued as well that violence, a lot of violence was alcohol related, and they argued that a woman in particular would have suffered because of this here, and they argued that was reduced because of the lack of alcohol. They also argued that half of all crime would have been caused by alcohol prior to Prohibition, and that was actually reduced as well too. They also would have had a moral argument. They argued that certainly America was a better place without alcohol, that the incidents of divorce, of poverty and of violence were all reduced because of the lack of alcohol, because alcohol, they would have viewed alcohol as certainly bringing America down. Health-wise, clearly that was a positive effect. Liver disease was much reduced in the 1920s and early 30s because of the lack of abuse of alcohol as well too. Status as well. Status was a very big thing as well too back at this stage. So a lot of middle class people would have regarded drinking alcohol as being a working class thing, and they regarded as that drinking alcohol is actually bringing them towards poverty. So it's quite a snobby social aspect to this as well too. And race would have been a big issue as well too. Some regarded alcohol as being un-American. Remember, even elements of the Ku Klux Klan would have linked drinking alcohol to certain cultures, especially the German culture, Irish culture, which they would have been opposed to as well too. And then you would have had the rural divide as well too. So you would have had lots of rural America that would have been opposed to alcohol as well, and very much in favour of Prohibition. They were more conservative and more religious, and they even before Prohibition, a lot of those states actually got rid of alcohol from many of their areas within their states as well too. On the other side of the argument, then you have the wets. The wets oppose Prohibition. They believe it's the wrong law. They believe that it's made America a lot worse place, and they want it repealed. They want it removed. And again, it's going to be the first time in American history this has actually happened, but that's what they're aiming to do, to repeal Prohibition. What they argue is this. They argue that jobs, thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs have been lost or put at risk by Prohibition. They point to farms. They say, look, the barley crops, for example, are not being used because of Prohibition, and that really has affected American farming. Remember, American farms are really badly affected throughout the 1920s. Transportation as well has been affected. Advertising, breweries and distillers, the bar industry, the nightclub industry. They argue that it's all been really badly affected by Prohibition, and that has lost jobs, and especially in the 1930s when the Great Depression hits, they argue those jobs are more necessary than ever. So that's what the economic arguments would be. They also argue that tax before Prohibition, a lot of the breweries weren't really worried, because they knew that American breweries and distillers would have actually produced 1 in 7 American tax dollars. So that there would have been regarded as a huge part of the American tax system, and that was all lost because of Prohibition. Income tax had not made up the that amount of income as well too, and certainly in the 1930s they needed more tax to pay for the big welfare programs introduced in the New Deal. So bringing back alcohol and the ending Prohibition would have been very much a push factor for doing that in terms of creating jobs and creating more tax. Culture as well too. So many Americans regarded it as being completely un-American to ban things. America's the land of the free, and they saw the depth of the Prohibition Acts, the Volstead Act in particular, as being far too far-fetched in what was actually pushed forward. It even made things like Worcestershire sauce quite liable to be prohibited as well. It went that far, so they argued that this is completely un-American and needed to be reversed. Some migrant cultures as well too, the Irish and East European communities, working class, alcohol was really important to those communities, and not for abusing alcohol, but certainly for being part of their life. It was regarded as being very important. You also have responsible citizens as well too. So millions had acted responsibly of alcohol prior to Prohibition. It was only a minority, they would argue, that actually abused alcohol. They didn't see it a crime to be able to drink alcohol, and what they regarded it as is completely undermining the American legal system and the respect for the law. It made lots of ordinary Americans in effect criminals. It also undermined that respect for the law, and especially some very rich Americans like Pierre Dupont would have been very much against Prohibition because of this here. You also had big powerful groups as well. To remember, Prohibition was actually pushed by powerful pressure groups who wanted it pushed through. By the 1920s and 30s, you actually have huge pressure groups who want to have it repealed as well too, and they are just as well financed and just as well organised as prohibition groups. So you have even big women's groups as well too. Women's organisation for national prohibition reform would have been huge, even bigger than the prohibition groups. And then finally you have urban groups as well too. So remember, it's a very rural thing, prohibition. The urban groups would have fought back. They would have said, look, cities and towns across America have lost millions and millions of dollars. You have the nightclub industry pushed underground into speakeasies. You have all that money lost to criminal gangs as well too, and lots of American cities really badly affected by crime around this time too. And wealthy industrialists, they're determined that America needs to go back to having alcohol as part of American life. Certainly not abused, but certainly part of American life as well. So these are the two arguments for and against. You have the dries versus the wets, and this went on the whole way through the 1920s, and certainly would have led up to the repeal of Prohibition in the 1930s. Thanks very much for listening, I appreciate it.